The results of Boro's internal review are in, and we now not only know that Michael Carrick will be leaving the football club, but we now seem to be starting to hear the reasons why. What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be reading through an incredibly intriguing and well-written article from Scott Wilson at the Northern Echo, who, along with his colleague Dom Shaw, produce some of the best Boro-related news and content out there. You know, they're a great pair of local journals for the Northern Echo, who I think are one of the best insiders for all you need to know when it comes to Boro news. That with Craig Johns at the Gazette as well. I think the three of them do a great job, and Scott has done a fantastic job gathering information in relation to Boro's internal review and to why and what led to the decision, which of course led to Michael Carrick losing his job, and we'll look through that article now. Now, the one big takeaway I got from this article was that a lot of the reasons as to why it seems like the club come to the decision they did is very much aligned with what a lot of the fans have been thinking as well, and it is refreshing to, you know, and there's Carrick defenders out there, there's people who, you know, will call this a scapegoat, him getting thrown under the bus, whatever, and there will be, you know, people who will just defiantly defend Michael Carrick, and that's fine. But it is refreshing, I think, to read this and see that the people who are actually paid to do this as their job, to look at the club and look at the reasons as to why things are or maybe not working internally, it's really good to see that they have come to similar conclusions as to what I think a lot of fans have, and it aligns with a lot of stuff I've discussed on the channel, we've discussed on podcasts, many other Boro fans have said the same. So let's have a look at it then. So the average lifespan of a championship manager is approximately 10 months, which is crazy. Michael Carrick lasted almost 3 years. Steve Gibson's reputation for displaying loyalty is hard-earned, but even loyalty must eventually have its limits. Otherwise, it simply looks like you're burying your head in the sand. Even so, when Middlesbrough's season ended with defeat at Coventry City, Gibson's immediate instinct was to stick with his head coach, which is something we mentioned yesterday in the reaction video we did. He liked having Carrick as the figurehead of the club, admired the former England international's honesty and integrity. While he stood by the financial imperative behind selling Emmanuel Latalath in January, Boro's owner accepted it did weaken Carrick's squad at a key moment in the season. Carrick might have his faults, but the head coach wasn't the only person to blame for missing out on the playoffs, which is an absolutely bang on point. You know, it's not just all on Michael Carrick. It was a collective screw-up, but when you look at a lot of the issues that Boro had last season, a lot of the paths all lead back to Michael Carrick. But it is true, Steve Gibson didn't want to sack him. I believe firmly that this was the last resort. This was their final resort, something that they didn't want to revert to. But whether it was down to however they wanted to reset up and rejig the coaching team, the recruitment, whatever it was, I think they definitely tried to keep Carrick and they definitely tried to work something out. But somewhere along the lines, they couldn't agree on whatever, and they decided it was best to part ways. That's my theory, anyway. He then goes on to say, nevertheless, a 10th place finish had to be regarded as unacceptable, which I also agree with, and Gibson was aware of rumblings from within the club about Carrick's perceived limitations. An internal review would be conducted, examining a host of issues that might have contributed to a campaign that never got going. Clearly, Carrick's future would form a key part of the investigation. So interesting. As always, we knew that everything would be reviewed, but rumblings from within the club regarding Carrick's perceived limitations. And we'd already heard whispers of that, you know, people within the club maybe weren't as convinced about Carrick as what Steve Gibson was. From an early stage, concerns became apparent, so maybe we're looking pre-January here. Results and the consequent league table were bad enough. Yes, there were mitigating factors, but given Boro's wage bill, which I think is 5th or 6th, 7th, but highest in the Championship, Boro's wage bill and the strength of a squad that even Carrick described, which he did at the start of the season, as the best of his reign throughout the first half of the season, why had the club performed so poorly, losing as many games as they won, which is a true point, and that is something that I think gets lost within the wash, really, when it comes to reviewing Boro's season. Yeah, a lot went wrong in January, a lot went wrong after January, but things weren't all rosy pre-January either. We were still throwing games away, we were still mismanaging games terribly, and dropping stupid points and stupid results left, right and centre. So, you know, it goes pre-January and post-January for me. And this is where things get really, really interesting. Why did Boro fall below or finish below Millwall? I agree. I think Boro missing out on the playoffs was bad enough, finishing below a number of clubs who had huge instability, a fraction of Boro's budget, protests against the owners, Boro finishing below Blackburn, Millwall, even Bristol City, I think was unacceptable. And it was described by one senior figure at the club despairingly as Middlesbrough B, which is weird because it's the exact point I made on the channel, Chris made when he was on the podcast with me, the fact that Boro finished below a side that had a lot of players that Boro deemed not good enough, who left us to go to Millwall, and they finished better than us. Basically, they've done a lot better with their squad. They've gotten more out of it than the sum of its parts, maximised what they could out of it, and Alex Neil has managed to get more out of that team than what Carrick did Boro's, and that's why, with a fraction of the budget and a squad that was definitely inferior to Boro's, they finished higher. It references Liam Roberts, George Saville, Duncan Watmore and Josh Coburn as all former Boro players who've left, deemed not good enough for Boro, went there and were part of a squad that finished above us. Why did they end up 2 points behind Blackburn, a club that were in crisis for most of the campaign? True, when we went there in February or March, I think it was February, they had protests against their owners. They looked like they're in free fall. They've even finished above Boro. And of course, the elephant in the room, which I think was what really got at Boro fans all season, and that's before the gaping points chasm separating Boro from North East rival Sunderland was even considered. So, yeah, officials at the club shared the same sort of feelings as many fans did. Yeah, not being in the top six was one thing. Finishing below a number of the clubs that we did made it even worse. He then moves on to say the words of rival managers were regarded as especially damning. While opposition bosses often praised Carrick for sticking to his principles, the comments could be interpreted as damning when they were repeatedly followed by an assertion that Boro were easy to predict and counteract. Some metrics, passing success rate, ball retention and Boro performing well, but others like chance conversion rate, big chance creation, XG underperformance were bitterly disappointing and regressed during the course of the campaign. Now I think a lot of that is down to the players we had, losing Lath, losing Doak through injury, but I do feel like as much as them stats regressing isn't all on Carrick, it was down to the personnel and the squad he was given post-January. The top bit is true. Managers continually came out and in as complimentary manner as they could, pretty much said Boro were predictable. They knew exactly what they were going to get from Boro, game in, game out, and too often Boro would start games well, but once the opposition adapted to what Boro were doing, that was it. We didn't have a plan B. We didn't have an alternative way of playing. The oppositions were able to change things, take the game away from Boro, game over. So Boro being predictable, that's another issue that definitely comes back to Carrick and his style of play. What was Carrick doing to address his side's slump? On the face of it, very little. Supporters were bemoaning the former boss's tactical rigidity and reluctance to make decisive in-game changes throughout last season, and those concerns were also shared within the club. Another thing that fans have mentioned a ton of times, how he's more reactive than proactive. How often in games did we see the opposition act first, make subs before Boro did, change the game in their favour? Boro never really did that, or if we did, it was too late. That was picked up within the club as well. And this is quite a damning quote. As one senior figure put it, who wants to go to see a film when 10 minutes in, you're pretty sure you've seen it before and you know what the ending is going to be? Ouch. On too far many occasions, Carrick's Boro let promising positions slip and were unable to alter the course of the game. Another thing I can't disagree with, and another thing I'm glad the club have seen. Yet, once again, the amount of times the game was changed by the opposition, who at times had inferior options to what Boro did, you could say, and Carrick just, either made changes too late or didn't make them at all, or didn't recognise the changes that needed to be made. Another issue, which of course I don't think is just down to Carrick, but still could be, injury prevention was another big worry. It has been for 2 years now. There will also be an element of luck behind a club's injury record, which is true, and a whole medical, fitness and sports science department is involved in the prevention and treatment of injuries. The head coach also has a role though, and there were internal concerns throughout last season about the number of injuries Boro were sustaining and the match time that was being lost because of player unavailability. A massive frustration, one that you've got to sympathise with Carrick for. I also think there may be something within his training methods, how the players train, the intensity they train, the recovery. That's more of a collective effort, though, I would say, in regards to the coaching staff, the medical team, etc. So that, as well as the players Carrick lost in January, I do sympathise him with. All the other stuff, though, I think is pretty true. It also says it is understood that a thorough investigation of the medical procedures and the chain of command played a major role in last month's review, something they've been trying to get right for a while. I hope they get right going into next season, because it doesn't matter how good of a squad you have. If they're always injured, it doesn't make a difference, does it? Then there was the issue of recruitment. This is interesting. Boro have devoted a lot of time and energy to the development of a new recruitment structure and ethos in the last few years. Led by head of football Kieran Scott, the recruitment team have prioritised a certain type of signing, which we've mentioned a ton of times, focusing on players with development potential rather than short-term stopgaps. Thanks to the likes of Latelath, Morgan Rogers and Rav Vandenberg, the shift has been successful. It broke down in January though, which it did. Boro have made a point of it. They did last summer, of not going after loans, sticking to permanent signings, making sure the players we were bringing in were our own players, and we weren't going to find ourselves back in a 22-23 situation where we lose all of our loans and we have to rebuild a whole squad. Weirdly, we reverted back to that in January, which didn't make any sense. Partly that was out of necessity because of the late decision to cash in on Latelath, which is a massive subject that has divided Boro fans, which left a small window in which to recruit a new forward, but options were placed on the table that would have been in keeping with Boro's wider recruitment model, instead having already insisted on re-signing Ryan Giles despite reservations from some senior officials. Carrick unwaveringly championed the acquisition of Kelechi Iheanacho, having called on at least one of his former Manchester United teammates to provide a character reference. That teammate we believe to be Johnny Evans, who did play alongside Iheanacho at Leicester City. This is an interesting paragraph. Now, I do again sympathise with Carrick in regards to the Latelath signing. If there's one thing we have to stop doing, it is selling players mid-season. However, if it is true that options were placed on the table that are very much, or were in similar keep with Boro's recruitment model, which I'm assuming were strikers from lower leagues or abroad, who again were probably going to be bought for a small fee, and then of course were going to be sold on for more. They were given to Carrick. He seemed desperate to bring in Kelechi Iheanacho as his answer. Now, I'm torn on this. I'm kind of glad Boro didn't go and double down on a permanent signing, because if that had have failed, we'd have had a player who we'd be stuck with and we couldn't get rid of. You know, the one benefit of Giles and Iheanacho, who are referenced here, is that they were loan signings, so they were low risk. So I'm glad Boro didn't commit to anything major in January in that regard. However, the judgment to which we signed Kelechi Iheanacho does not look good on Michael Carrick at all. The second he stepped foot on the pitch at Bramall Lane, we all saw that he looked unfit, he looked overweight, and he looked miles off it. So the fact that the club as a whole, no one stepped in and said, let's not do this. He doesn't look ready. He doesn't look like a good fit. And we sign him anyway. That, I think, is just a mess, regardless of how you look at it. But of course, if it was Carrick that was pushing and they gave in and gave him the signing, that doesn't look good on him. Ryan Giles is a tough one. He did fit the profile of what Boro want from a left-back, but he'd had a poor 18 months where he'd been out of form for a long time, and it sounds like some senior officials were against bringing him back in. But again, Carrick wanted him. Carrick got what he wanted. Neither worked. Both moves were a disaster, with the only saving grace and the fact that Boro's recruitment leaders put their foot down and insisted that the moves for Giles and Iheanacho were only loan deals. So, well, maybe there was someone in the club who wanted permanent deals. Maybe Carrick, I don't know. But thank God the recruitment leaders at the club put their foot down and only committed to loans. Or at least that means Boro have been able to hand both players back rather than be saddled with them on an expensive long-term deals, which I've just mentioned. Having got his way in January, the fear was that Carrick would push hard for a similar type of signing in the summer, creating the kind of internal recruitment tensions that were so destabilising under Neil Warnock and Chris Wilder. So this is also really interesting, because one of the reasons why I was sceptical on Michael Carrick was because I didn't trust that he would bring in the right type of players and characters that Boro needed to go into next season. I was worried he would just bring in the same sort of nice tippy-tappy flair players who might be keen on the eye and might do you a good job when you're going up against Oxford at home and you're 3-0 up, but could absolutely fall and their asses would fall out and they'd just, they'd lose their heads and they'd crumble under the occasion when we needed a result away at Millwall, for example. So I did have a lot of scepticism around Michael Carrick's judgment on players and giving him another transfer window. And if we bring in the right profile of players we needed, because I think we need more hardened championship experienced pros in the team, and it's seemingly clear that the club felt similar. They were worried, had we kept Carrick, there might have been a clash in regards to what we needed and what he wanted from the recruitment team in the summer and the players he wanted. So to avoid the same sort of tensions, they decided that maybe the relationship between Carrick, Scott and the teams there would not work going forward and was at risk of going south, which is interesting. By the end of the review process, the recommendation was clear. Yes, there were a number of factors behind Boro's failure last season, and the intention is to systematically address them in the next few weeks and months. Ultimately, though, it was concluded that the biggest single factor that could avoid a repeat of last season's underachievement was the appointment of a new head coach. Could Gibson be persuaded that this was the right choice of action? For all that Boro's decision-making has become more collegiate? Collegiate? It's a good word. In recent years, the big calls, and they don't come much bigger than changing your boss, are determined by Gibson. Of course, he's the man with the final say. Boro's owner is justifiably proud of the fact that he gives his head coaches time. He has. I think he's gave Carrick more than enough time. I don't think it's unfair that he's been relieved of his duties at all after almost 3 years at the club. His personal loyalty to Carrick wasn't just a front. He genuinely admires the North-Easterner and has repeatedly expressed confidence that he will develop into a top-class boss, which I think he will as well, under the right circumstances. Ultimately, though, there's not much point in trusting senior employees to carry out a forensic review if you're then going to ignore their key recommendations. Basically, he's got people who he pays to do a job at the club. He pays them to look into these issues. He pays them to come out with the correct conclusion. Their conclusion was that, in the end, Carrick was the man who needed to be removed, as well as some of his coaching team. Gibson pays them. He pays for their judgment. That's what they're employed for. He's obviously not going to ignore their thoughts and feelings, and he has gave in. So maybe this leans into the fact that Gibson didn't want him gone. I don't believe he did. I think they were trying to work things out, but no matter which way they looked at it, they kept coming back to this conclusion. Scott finishes in his article by saying Carrick has gone. He shone brightly in his first season, regressed in his second, and then displayed increasingly damaging weakness in his third, and that ultimately became his undoing. Perhaps one day he will learn from his mistakes and develop into a more successful boss, which I think he will. That will be someone else's concern, though. Boro's next key review will be to assess his strengths, the strengths and weaknesses of the shortlisted candidates to be his replacement. So that is a fantastic article. Do let me know in your thoughts in the comment section below. But it is refreshing to see that the people employed at the club come to the same conclusions that a lot of us fans did. The teams we finished beneath, the choices made in January. And again, this is a fair, I think, review. There's still recognition that Carrick was not to blame for everything. But all roads still led back to him on a numerous variety of issues that we had. I've also mentioned a few others. Home form has continued to be poor. Have season ticket sales led to this decision as well? We don't know. Defensively, of course, has always been a big issue. We don't know how much of Carrick played a part in the injuries, the training, and how that worked, as well as obviously who on earth made the decisions that were made in January. It seems like Carrick, was a big part to play in them. There are also other things that the club need to improve on. Selling their best player in January is not good enough. We can't keep doing that. I know a lot of people will still say Carrick was undermined by some of the recruitment, but I think regardless of what club you go to, it doesn't matter if you're a top Premier League club or a club in the National League, you're going to have hits and misses in recruitment, so that's just part and parcel of football for me. So I don't think that's something you can throw as a defence of Carrick either. But it's a very, very interesting article. Scott deserves immense credit. He's done such good work with this. So as I mentioned, go and follow him over on X. Go and read the article, and also go and follow the Northern Echo for all the best Boro news. They also do a mean podcast called You Are My Boro, which is fantastic and a great listen as well. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on the decision, the reasons given here on why Michael Carrick has lost his job, and whether you agree or disagree with them. And hopefully we'll see who his replacement is in the coming days. I'll be back tomorrow with a Project Boro podcast with Chris to discuss the whole thing, and we're really glad that this has dropped because it gives us a lot more meat on the bone to discuss. So stay subscribed for that, but until next time guys, take care and I'll see you all